The pristine white hull stretched endlessly beneath the crystalline Mediterranean waters, her massive propellers frozen mid-revolution in their final, desperate thrust. Red crosses, once symbols of mercy and healing, now decorated a tomb where bandages and surgical instruments lay scattered across tilted decks like abandoned prayers. The ship's bridge windows stared blindly upward through 400 feet of azure silence, while schools of fish darted through what had been the largest vessel ever built. Her palatial staterooms transformed into coral gardens of twisted metal and fading hope. This was HMHS Britannic, Titanic's forgotten sister, resting in a watery grave more intact and accessible than her famous siblings' shattered remains. She had been designed to be unsinkable, equipped with every lesson learned from maritime disaster, yet she had sunk faster than the Titanic herself. Was the Britannic a victim of war's cruel randomness? Or had something far more sinister sealed her fate? In the bustling shipyards of Belfast, the hammering of 10,000 rivets echoed with the confidence of an empire that believed it could conquer both sea and fate. The year 1911 had witnessed the launch of the Titanic amid unprecedented fanfare, her massive hull sliding into the murky waters of the River Lagan, while thousands of spectators cheered from every available vantage point. Yet even as champagne bottles shattered against her bow and brass bands played triumphant marches, the third sister of the Olympic class remained nothing more than steel plates and blueprints in the cavernous halls of Harland and Wolff shipyard. The Britannic existed only in the fevered imagination of naval architects who had already begun incorporating the hard-won lessons that tragedy would soon teach them. Thomas Andrews, the brilliant chief designer whose reputation would forever be intertwined with maritime disaster, had originally conceived the Olympic-class vessels as monuments to Edwardian excess. The initial designs prioritized opulence over safety, featuring grand staircases that soared through multiple decks like cathedral spires, crystal chandeliers that transformed dining rooms into glittering palaces, and swimming pools lined with Turkish tiles that rivaled the baths of ancient Rome. The Britannic was intended to surpass even these magnificent sisters, incorporating innovations that would establish new standards for luxury ocean travel. Her first-class accommodations were planned to include private promenades, en-suite bathrooms with heated floors, and a gymnasium equipped with the latest exercise apparatus imported from Germany. The White Star Line's managing director, J. Bruce Ismay, had envisioned the three ships as floating extensions of the finest London hotels, complete with French chefs, Italian marble, and service that would cater to every whim of the Atlantic crossing elite. The Britannic's original passenger manifest was designed to accommodate 2,535 souls in unprecedented comfort, with even third-class passengers enjoying amenities that surpassed first-class accommodations on older vessels. The ship's restaurants were planned to serve cuisine prepared in kitchens rivaling those of the Savoy Hotel, while her smoking rooms and libraries would provide gentlemen's clubs, atmosphere complete with leather-bound volumes and humidors stocked with Cuban cigars. The scale of ambition behind these vessels defied comprehension, even by the standards of an age accustomed to industrial marvels. The Britannic measured 915 feet in length, stretching longer than 3 football fields placed end to end, her massive frame requiring 26,000 tons of steel that had been forged in furnaces burning continuously for months. Her gross tonnage reached 48,158 tons, making her the largest moving object ever created by human hands, while her 9 decks rose 175 feet above the waterline like a floating skyscraper. The construction process consumed 3 million rivets each one heated to glowing orange and hammered into place by teams of craftsmen whose rhythmic pounding created an industrial symphony that echoed across Belfast for 4 years. Her 4 massive funnels, each large enough to drive a train through, were designed to exhale the breath of 29 boilers housed in 6 enormous engine rooms that stretched deep into her belly. However, the disaster of April 15, 1912, transformed everything. When news of the Titanic sinking reached the Harland and Wolff offices, emergency meetings convened throughout the night as engineers and executives grappled with the unthinkable reality that their unsinkable ship lay broken on the Atlantic floor. The Britannic, still under construction, became both an opportunity for redemption and a canvas upon which the maritime industry could rewrite its fundamental assumptions about safety at sea. Andrews, who had perished aboard his greatest creation, had left behind detailed notes and recommendations that would guide the radical redesign of his final masterpiece. The transformation of the Britannic from luxury liner to fortress of safety represented one of the most comprehensive engineering overhauls in maritime history. Workers stripped away ornamental features that might impede emergency evacuations, replacing grand staircases with wider, more numerous stairwells that could accommodate panicked crowds. The ship's hull received a revolutionary double-bottom design that extended higher up her sides, creating a protective barrier against the kind of damage that had doomed her sister. Watertight compartments increased from 16 to 17, with enhanced pumping systems capable of removing water faster than most anticipated flooding scenarios could introduce it. The lifeboat capacity underwent the most dramatic expansion, growing from accommodation for 1,178 souls to spaces for 2,700 passengers and crew. New davits designed by the Welland Quadrant Davit Company could launch boats, even with the ship listing at severe angles, addressing one of the critical failures that had cost hundreds of lives during the Titanic disaster. These mechanical marvels operated on a revolutionary sliding system that eliminated the need for manual hauling, allowing crews to deploy lifeboats in minutes rather than the laborious process that had proved so tragically inadequate in the North Atlantic darkness. Yet beneath these technological improvements lurked a deeper transformation in philosophy that would ultimately define the Britannic's destiny. The ship evolved from a symbol of peacetime prosperity into an embodiment of humanity's growing recognition of its own vulnerability. Her designers had learned that the ocean remained an adversary that demanded respect rather than conquest, that safety systems required redundancy upon redundancy, and that the margin between triumph and catastrophe measured thinner than the steel plates protecting passengers from the abyss. Britannic's construction timeline stretched from 1911 to 1915, years that witnessed the world's transformation from an age of optimistic progress into an era of unprecedented industrial violence. As workers installed her revolutionary safety equipment, armies across Europe deployed technologies of destruction that would soon make the ocean crossing she was designed for seem quaint by comparison. The ship that emerged from her Belfast birthplace bore little resemblance to her original conception, having evolved into something unprecedented, a vessel designed not for the pursuit of luxury, but for survival itself. The Great War's declaration transformed the Britannic from a symbol of peacetime prosperity into an instrument of wartime necessity before she ever carried her first paying passenger. On August 4, 1914, as Britain's ultimatum to Germany expired and the empire found itself thrust into a conflict that would consume an entire generation, the nearly completed vessel rested in her Belfast berth like a sleeping giant awaiting her true calling. The luxury fittings that had been painstakingly installed over 3 years suddenly appeared as frivolous relics of a vanished world, their crystal and marble splendor rendered meaningless by the thunder of artillery that had begun echoing across the European continent. The Admiralty's requisition came with swift bureaucratic efficiency on November 13, 1915, accompanied by orders that would strip the Britannic of her intended identity and reshape her into something the world had never seen before. Naval architects descended upon the ship like surgeons preparing for a massive operation, their blueprints and measuring instruments replacing the interior designers who had been selecting wallpaper patterns and carpet colors just months earlier. The transformation ahead would be so complete that passengers boarding the finished vessel would find themselves in an environment that bore no resemblance to the floating palace, originally conceived by the White Star Line's ambitious executives. Workers began the metamorphosis by removing the grand staircase that had been designed to rival the Titanic's magnificent centerpiece. Its ornate balustrades and carved cherubs hauled away to warehouses where they would gather dust for the remainder of the war. In its place rose utilitarian corridors wide enough to accommodate stretchers carried by medical personnel rushing between operating theaters. The first-class dining room, with its soaring ceiling and French windows, gave way to surgical suites equipped with the latest medical technology available to military hospitals. Electric lighting replaced the romantic ambiance of oil lamps, while linoleum floors superseded Persian carpets that had been woven in the markets of Istanbul and Damascus. The ship's luxury cabins underwent the most dramatic transformation, their silk wallpaper and mahogany paneling stripped away to reveal bare metal bulkheads that could be easily cleaned and disinfected. Each stateroom was reconfigured to accommodate hospital beds arranged with military precision, their spacing calculated to provide medical staff with optimal access to patients while maximizing the number of wounded soldiers who could be transported on each voyage. The private bathrooms, with their Italian marble fixtures, became utility spaces for medical equipment, while the reading nooks and writing desks, where passengers had planned to compose letters home, were replaced with storage areas for bandages, medications, and surgical instruments. The scale of the Britannic's medical conversion defied the imagination of even experienced naval architects who had overseen similar wartime transformations. The vessel's hospital configuration included 52 operating rooms distributed across multiple decks, each one equipped with surgical tables, anesthesia equipment, and recovery beds positioned to take advantage of natural lighting from strategically placed portholes. Her medical staff complement numbered 673 personnel, including surgeons trained in the latest battlefield medicine techniques, nurses recruited from London's most prestigious hospitals, and orderlies selected for their ability to function under the extreme stress of treating massive casualties. The ship's pharmacy contained medications worth $50,000, equivalent to $3 million in contemporary currency, while her storage areas held 500,000 bandages, 25,000 surgical instruments, and emergency supplies sufficient to establish field hospitals for entire Army divisions. Her freshwater capacity expanded to 1,750 tons to accommodate the increased hygiene requirements of medical operations, while dedicated sterilization facilities could process contaminated equipment around the clock during extended voyages. The Britannic's maiden voyage as HMHS Britannic commenced on December 23, 1915, under the command of Captain Charles Bartlett, a veteran mariner whose experience with passenger vessels had not prepared him for the unique challenges of operating a floating hospital in wartime conditions. The ship's destination was the Eastern Mediterranean, where the disastrous Gallipoli campaign had produced casualties on a scale that overwhelmed existing medical evacuation capabilities. Her pristine white hull, marked with enormous red crosses visible from miles away, cut through waters that had become hunting grounds for German submarines, whose commanders operated under increasingly flexible interpretations of international maritime law. The wounded soldiers who boarded the Britannic during her early voyages encountered a vessel that existed in an eerie liminal space between luxury liner and military hospital, her corridors echoing with sounds that would have been unimaginable during peacetime operations. The gentle hum of her engines, originally designed to provide a soothing backdrop for elegant dinner conversations, now accompanied the groans of men whose bodies had been shattered by artillery shells and machine gun fire. The dining rooms where passengers had planned to sample French cuisine served instead as recovery wards where military doctors performed emergency amputations and treated gas poisoning cases that arrived with every transport from the front lines. Some crew members reported strange phenomena during the ship's conversion period, claiming to hear phantom sounds of construction work echoing through completed sections during the quiet hours of night shifts. The rational explanation involved thermal expansion and contraction of the massive steel hull, creating acoustic effects that resembled human activity, combined with the psychological stress experienced by workers laboring under wartime pressure. Yet the persistence of these reports, documented in multiple crew diaries and official maintenance logs, suggested that the Britannic's transformation had created an atmosphere where the boundary between imagination and reality became increasingly difficult to distinguish. The ship's medical mission represented both the nobility of human compassion and the industrial efficiency with which modern warfare produced its casualties. During her brief service career, she would transport 15,000 wounded soldiers across 34,000 nautical miles of Mediterranean waters, her hospital wards bearing witness to the century's most devastating conflict, while her advanced safety systems provided reassurance that at least some lessons from previous maritime disasters had been absorbed by naval architects and ship operators. The Britannic had become something unprecedented in maritime history, a vessel designed for survival that had been repurposed to preserve life, sailing through waters where death lurked beneath every wave. On November 21st, 1916, the Britannic steamed through waters where ancient Greek tragedies had played out millennia before, unaware that she was sailing toward her own catastrophic finale. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Aegean Sea as the hospital ship maintained her steady course through the Key Channel, her massive white hull cutting through waters that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires since before recorded history began. Captain Charles Bartlett stood on the bridge, studying charts that marked these treacherous waters with symbols indicating hidden reefs, unpredictable currents, and depth variations that had claimed vessels for over 3,000 years. The sixth voyage to the eastern Mediterranean had commenced with the routine efficiency that characterized all of the Britannic's medical missions. Her departure from Southampton marked by the same careful loading of medical supplies and personnel that had become standard procedure during her year of service. The ship carried 1,065 souls aboard her steel decks, including 673 medical personnel whose expertise represented the finest battlefield medicine available to the British military. Her cargo holds opins. 020 radowins contained surgical equipment destined for field hospitals in Mesopotamia, while her converted passenger areas housed medical staff returning to combat zones after brief respites in England's military hospitals. The Key Channel had earned its fearsome reputation through centuries of maritime disasters, its narrow passages and shifting currents, creating navigational challenges that tested even the most experienced captains. Ancient Greek navigators had whispered warnings about these waters, passing down stories of ships that vanished without trace, and crews who reported seeing phantom lights dancing above the waves during moonless nights. Modern charts identified more prosaic dangers: underwater rock formations that rose unexpectedly from the seabed, tidal patterns that could drive vessels off course within minutes, and weather conditions that changed with Mediterranean unpredictability. The Great War had transformed these already dangerous waters into a maritime battlefield where German U-boats prowled beneath the surface like predatory sharks. The Kaiser's submarine fleet had established a deadly presence throughout the eastern Mediterranean, their commanders operating under increasingly aggressive rules of engagement that blurred the traditional distinctions between military and civilian targets. Hospital ships, despite their protected status under international maritime law, sailed through waters where desperation and strategic necessity had begun to override diplomatic niceties established during peacetime conferences in comfortable European capitals. Captain Bartlett maintained strict blackout procedures as his ship navigated through the pre-dawn darkness, her running lights extinguished to avoid attracting the attention of submarine periscopes that might be scanning the horizon for targets. The Britannic's massive silhouette made concealment impossible during daylight hours, her distinctive hospital markings visible from considerable distances to anyone equipped with naval binoculars. The red crosses painted on her hull and superstructure, designed to ensure protection under the Geneva Convention, served instead as beacons that announced her presence to friend and foe alike across miles of open water. The scale of maritime warfare in the eastern Mediterranean had reached unprecedented levels of intensity during 1916, transforming traditional shipping lanes into gauntlets of destruction that challenged every vessel attempting passage. German U-boats had sunk 142 Allied vessels in Mediterranean waters during the previous 6 months, their torpedo attacks and mine-laying operations claiming 23 tons of shipping per week at the height of their campaign. The Britannic's hospital ship status provided theoretical protection, but 17 medical vessels had already been attacked during 1916, with 8 confirmed sinkings resulting in 1,200 casualties among medical personnel and wounded soldiers. British naval intelligence had documented 23 active German submarines operating in the eastern Mediterranean, supported by 12 mine-laying vessels that had deployed over 2,000 explosive devices in shipping channels between Crete and the Turkish mainland. The Key Channel alone contained an estimated 150 mines, according to Admiralty reports that reached Captain Bartlett just days before his departure from Southampton. Some crew members reported unusual atmospheric conditions during the voyage, describing an oppressive feeling that seemed to emanate from the sea itself, accompanied by dreams filled with images of drowning sailors and sinking ships. The rational explanation involved the psychological stress experienced by maritime personnel operating in combat zones, combined with the documented effects of prolonged exposure to the low-frequency vibrations produced by the ship's massive engines. These infrasonic waves, below the threshold of human hearing, had been observed to produce anxiety, unease, and vivid nightmares in sensitive individuals. Yet the consistency of these reports across different crew members, many of whom had no previous history of such experiences, suggested that the Britannic's passage through these ancient waters had created conditions that amplified both natural phenomena and human susceptibility to their effects. The strategic importance of the Eastern Mediterranean had drawn the attention of military planners from every major European power, transforming the region into a crucible where naval technology, international law, and human desperation intersected with often tragic results. The British evacuation from Gallipoli had left thousands of wounded soldiers scattered across temporary medical facilities from Alexandria to Salonika, their treatment and transport requiring a complex network of hospital ships, medical personnel, and supply vessels that operated under constant threat of enemy action. The waters surrounding the Greek islands had become a maze of defensive measures and offensive operations, where Allied minesweepers worked around the clock to clear shipping channels while German submarines and surface raiders deployed new explosive devices faster than they could be neutralized. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces had developed innovative mine designs specifically intended to defeat the defensive measures employed by hospital ships. Their magnetic triggers and delayed action fuses designed to create maximum psychological impact on medical personnel and their patients. The Britannic's approach to the Key Channel represented the culmination of military planning, technological innovation, and human courage that characterized the maritime war in the Eastern Mediterranean. Her mission embodied the highest ideals of medical neutrality, while her passage through these contested waters acknowledged the brutal reality that modern warfare recognized few boundaries between combatant and non-combatant targets. At precisely 8:12 a.m., a sound like thunder split the peaceful morning air, and the unsinkable ship began her race against time and physics. The explosion erupted from the starboard bow with the devastating fury of industrial-grade destruction, its shock wave rippling through the Britannic's steel frame like seismic tremors through mountain bedrock. The blast tore open a gaping wound in her reinforced hull, flooding her forward compartments with Mediterranean seawater that poured through the breach with the relentless power of a breached dam. In the engine rooms deep within her belly, stokers felt the deck plates shudder beneath their feet as gauges throughout the ship registered the catastrophic damage that would transform the morning's routine voyage into maritime history's most perfectly documented hospital ship disaster. Captain Charles Bartlett rushed to the bridge as emergency bells clanged throughout the vessel, their bronze voices cutting through the Mediterranean morning, calm with urgent warnings that sent crew members racing to their emergency stations. The ship's advanced damage control systems, installed after the Titanic disaster, had revealed the deadly consequences of inadequate flooding response, immediately began their automated sequences. Watertight doors slammed shut with pneumatic precision, their steel barriers designed to compartmentalize flooding and provide the vessel with precious time to mount effective countermeasures. Yet even as these engineering marvels performed exactly as their designers had intended, seawater continued pouring into the Britannic's forward sections at rates that exceeded the capacity of her revolutionary pumping systems. The hospital ship's unique configuration created emergency challenges that naval architects had never anticipated when designing passenger vessel evacuation procedures. Medical equipment that had been secured for rough weather broke loose as the ship developed her initial list, surgical instruments sliding across tilted decks, while medical supplies scattered through corridors that had been transformed from orderly hospital wards into scenes of controlled chaos. Wounded soldiers, many of whom were bedridden patients recovering from battlefield injuries, required assistance from medical personnel who were themselves struggling to maintain their footing on decks that pitched at increasingly severe angles. Violet Jessup, the veteran stewardess whose survival of the Titanic disaster had made her something of a celebrity among White Star Line personnel, found herself reliving a nightmare that she had hoped never to experience again. The familiar sounds of a ship in mortal distress echoed through her consciousness as she moved through the Britannic's tilting corridors, assisting patients and crew members while drawing upon hard-won experience that few human beings possessed. Her presence aboard the doomed vessel represented one of maritime history's most remarkable coincidences, a convergence of fate and circumstance that would provide historians with first-hand accounts from someone uniquely qualified to compare the two greatest passenger ship disasters of the early 20th century. The explosion's cause remained immediately unclear to the ship's officers, who faced the critical task of determining whether they were dealing with a mine strike, torpedo attack, or internal mechanical failure that required different emergency responses. German U-boats were known to operate in these waters, their commanders increasingly willing to target vessels that carried hospital markings in direct violation of international maritime law. Alternative explanations included floating mines that had broken loose from their moorings during recent Mediterranean storms, or defensive explosive devices that had been deployed by Allied forces to protect shipping channels from enemy submarines. The Britannic's advanced safety features, incorporated after extensive analysis of the Titanic disaster, began demonstrating both their effectiveness and their limitations as the flooding progressed beyond the parameters that naval architects had considered possible. Her double-hull construction provided additional protection against smaller breaches, but the massive hole torn in her starboard bow exceeded the design specifications that had seemed adequate when calculated in the comfortable offices of Harland and Wolff Shipyard. The 17 watertight compartments that had been installed to prevent catastrophic flooding were performing their intended function, yet the sheer volume of water entering through the damaged sections threatened to overwhelm even these revolutionary safety measures. The scale of destruction wrought by the 8:12 a.m. explosion exceeded anything previously recorded in hospital ship operations during the Great War. The blast created a hole measuring approximately 100 feet in length and 15 feet in height along the Britannic's starboard side, allowing Mediterranean seawater to flood her forward compartments at a rate of 3,000 tons per minute. Within 10 minutes of the initial explosion, the ship had developed a list of 15 degrees to starboard, while her bow had settled 8 feet deeper into the water as her forward buoyancy chambers filled with seawater. Emergency pumping systems, capable of removing 1,700 tons of water per hour under optimal conditions, proved inadequate against the massive influx that resulted from the hull breach. The ship's revolutionary electrical systems continued functioning despite the flooding, maintaining power to emergency lighting, communication equipment, and the mechanical davits that would prove crucial for launching lifeboats as the vessel's list increased beyond safe operating parameters. Several crew members reported hearing strange sounds preceding the explosion, describing metallic groaning noises that seemed to emanate from the sea itself, followed by an eerie silence that lasted approximately 30 seconds before the blast occurred. The rational explanation involved the acoustic effects produced by floating mines as their anchoring chains scraped against their explosive mechanisms, combined with the natural sound distortion that occurred when underwater objects approached a vessel's steel hull. These phenomena, well documented in naval warfare manuals, could create auditory effects that untrained listeners might interpret as supernatural warnings. Yet the precision with which multiple witnesses described the timing and sequence of these sounds, recorded independently in their subsequent testimony, suggested that the Britannic's final moments had been preceded by acoustic signatures that deserved more detailed analysis than wartime conditions permitted. The morning's catastrophic events unfolded with the mechanical precision of a perfectly executed naval mine attack, each sequential development following the mathematical principles that governed maritime disasters involving large passenger vessels. The Britannic's massive size, which had provided her with unprecedented stability during normal operations, now worked against her as the flooding progressed through compartments that had never been tested under actual combat conditions. The ship had become a laboratory for testing the limits of early 20th century naval architecture. Her revolutionary safety systems engaged in a desperate battle against the Mediterranean Sea itself. As the Mediterranean rushed through her reinforced hull, the Britannic revealed that all human engineering remained powerless against the sea's patient hunger. The ship's advanced safety features, designed with meticulous precision to prevent another Titanic-scale catastrophe, proved woefully inadequate against the massive breach that had torn through her starboard bow like a giant's claw ripping through steel paper. Water cascaded into her forward compartments with the unstoppable force of nature itself. Each ton of seawater that invaded her hull, shifting her center of gravity and accelerating the deadly mathematics of maritime disaster that no amount of human ingenuity could reverse. Captain Charles Bartlett faced a decision that would haunt maritime historians for decades: whether to maintain steam and attempt to beach his dying ship, or to stop engines and focus entirely on evacuation procedures while the vessel remained stable enough to launch lifeboats. The rocky coastline of Kea lay tantalizingly close, its barren shores offering the theoretical possibility of grounding the Britannic in shallow water where her passengers and crew might wade to safety. Yet the captain's experience with large vessels warned him that driving a flooding ship forward at speed could force water deeper into her compromised hull, accelerating the very disaster he hoped to prevent. The controversial decision to maintain engine power and attempt a desperate run toward shore may have sealed the hospital ship's fate, transforming what might have been a controlled sinking into an accelerated plunge toward the Mediterranean floor. The Britannic's massive propellers continued churning the azure waters as her bow settled ever deeper, creating a ram effect that drove seawater through the hull breach with hydraulic pressure that overwhelmed her pumping systems. Each revolution of her engines pushed the vessel forward through water that rushed into her damaged sections like liquid dynamite, exploding through watertight compartments that had been designed to contain flooding rather than channel it throughout her internal structure. The open portholes that had been left unsealed to ventilate the hospital wards now became secondary points of water ingress as the ship's starboard list increased beyond the angles that her designers had considered survivable. Medical personnel had opened these brass-framed windows during the pleasant Mediterranean morning to provide fresh air for recovering patients, following standard hospital ship procedures that prioritized patient comfort over theoretical emergency protocols. As the Britannic tilted toward her starboard side, these innocent ventilation openings transformed into additional entry points for the relentless sea, each porthole admitting hundreds of gallons per minute as the vessel's list approached the critical angle where flooding would become irreversible. The ship's hospital configuration created evacuation challenges that exceeded anything anticipated by emergency planners who had focused primarily on healthy passengers capable of moving independently to lifeboat stations. Bedridden patients required stretcher transport through corridors that were tilting at increasingly severe angles, while medical equipment that had been secured for normal maritime conditions broke loose and became dangerous projectiles sliding across deck plates slick with seawater and medical supplies. Surgical instruments scattered through tilted operating theaters created hazardous obstacle courses that medical personnel had to navigate while carrying wounded soldiers toward uncertain salvation in lifeboats that swung precariously from davits, straining under unprecedented stress. The revolutionary Whelan Quadrant davits, installed after extensive analysis of the Titanic disaster, performed their intended function with mechanical precision that vindicated their designers' confidence in technological solutions to maritime emergencies. These engineering marvels could launch lifeboats even with the ship listing at severe angles, their innovative sliding systems eliminating the manual hauling that had proved so tragically inadequate during the 1912 disaster. Yet, even the most advanced lifeboat technology required human operators working under extreme stress, and the Britannic's rapid sinking provided minimal time for the careful procedures that had been practiced during peacetime drills conducted in calm harbors with healthy crew members. The mathematical precision with which the Britannic surrendered to the Mediterranean demonstrated the inexorable physics that governed all maritime disasters involving large passenger vessels. The ship sank in exactly 55 minutes from the moment of the initial explosion, significantly faster than the Titanic's 2 hours and 40 minutes of gradual submersion that had provided passengers and crew with sufficient time for relatively orderly evacuation procedures. Her final resting place measured 400 feet below the surface, compared to the Titanic's 12,500-foot grave in the North Atlantic abyss, placing the hospital ship's wreck within reach of future diving technology that would eventually reveal her secrets to underwater archaeologists. Of the 1,065 souls aboard, only 30 lives were lost, representing a 97% survival rate that vindicated the improved safety systems, while highlighting the tragedy of those whose deaths could have been prevented by slightly different circumstances. The wreck settled on the seabed in remarkably intact condition, with 93% of her structure remaining recognizable to modern investigators who would eventually document every detail of her final resting place. Violet Jessop, whose survival of both the Titanic and Britannic disasters would establish her as maritime history's most remarkable witness, later described hearing what she characterized as the ship's death song. A low, mournful sound that seemed to emerge from the vessel's steel framework as she surrendered to the sea. The rational explanation involved the acoustic effects produced by air escaping from flooding compartments, combined with the structural stress sounds generated by steel plates buckling under unprecedented pressure. These phenomena, well documented in naval architecture literature, created harmonic frequencies that human ears interpreted as almost musical tones. Yet Jessop's description, supported by similar accounts from other survivors, suggested that the Britannic's final moments had been accompanied by sounds that transcended mere mechanical noise, creating an auditory experience that haunted survivors for the remainder of their lives. The hospital ship's death throes unfolded with the terrible beauty of natural disaster, her massive hull settling into the Mediterranean with surprising grace despite the violence that had initiated her destruction. The Britannic had become a monument to both human ambition and human vulnerability, her revolutionary safety systems ultimately insufficient against the random brutality of modern warfare conducted in ancient waters that had witnessed countless maritime tragedies throughout recorded history. When Jacques Cousteau's cameras first illuminated the Britannic's ghostly superstructure in 1975, they revealed not just a shipwreck, but a time capsule preserving questions that had haunted maritime investigators for decades. The legendary oceanographer's diving bell descended through 400 feet of crystalline, Mediterranean water, its powerful lights piercing the eternal twilight to reveal a vessel so perfectly preserved that she appeared to have settled on the seabed just moments before. The Britannic lay on her starboard side like a sleeping giant, her massive hull stretching across the rocky bottom with her propellers embedded deep in the sediment, testament to her final, desperate attempt to reach the safety of shallow water near the Greek island of Kea. The wreck's extraordinary condition defied every expectation based on previous deep-water shipwreck discoveries, her steel plates and superstructure maintaining structural integrity that allowed detailed examination of features that had been obliterated on other vessels of similar age. Unlike the Titanic, whose remains lay scattered across the North Atlantic abyssal plain in fragments that required painstaking reconstruction to understand, the Britannic rested in magnificent wholeness that provided unprecedented insights into early 20th century naval architecture. Her 4 distinctive funnels remained attached to the hull, though tilted at impossible angles that created an otherworldly silhouette against the Mediterranean's deep blue backdrop. The ship's medical equipment lay scattered throughout her tilted corridors in configurations that told the story of her final 55 minutes with archaeological precision. Surgical instruments still gleamed in the diving lights, their stainless steel surfaces polished by decades of gentle currents that had swept away organic materials while preserving metallic artifacts in remarkable condition. Operating tables remained bolted to deck plates that had become vertical walls, their leather restraining straps floating like seaweed in the eternal currents that circulated through the wreck's interior spaces. Medical bottles and pharmaceutical containers created glittering constellations across what had once been hospital ward floors, their glass surfaces reflecting diving lights in patterns that resembled stars scattered across an underwater night sky. The mystery surrounding the explosion's true nature had deepened rather than resolved, as underwater archaeology revealed evidence that supported multiple theories about the disaster's cause. The massive hole in the Britannic's starboard bow bore characteristics consistent with both mine damage and torpedo impact, its jagged edges providing clues that naval experts interpreted differently depending on their theoretical perspectives. German naval records captured after World War I indicated that Kapitänleutnant Gustav Siess, commander of submarine U-73, had been operating in the Key Channel during November 1916 and had reported attacking a large hospital ship matching the Britannic's description. However, British Admiralty archives contained equally compelling evidence that German mine-laying operations had deployed explosive devices throughout the area where the hospital ship met her fate. The Type C contact mines used by German naval forces possessed sufficient explosive power to create the damage pattern observed on the wreck, while their magnetic triggering mechanisms could explain the precision timing of the blast that had torn through the ship's reinforced hull. Intelligence reports from Greek fishing vessels had documented numerous floating mines in the weeks preceding the disaster, their steel spheres studded with contact horns drifting with Mediterranean currents that carried them far from their original deployment positions. The debate between mine and torpedo causation represented more than academic interest for maritime historians, as the distinction carried profound implications for understanding the evolution of naval warfare during the Great War. A torpedo attack would have constituted a deliberate violation of international maritime law, protecting hospital ships, while a mine strike could be characterized as an unfortunate consequence of defensive measures that had been deployed without specific intent to target medical vessels. The evidence preserved within the Britannic's hull remained tantalizingly ambiguous, supporting both interpretations while definitively proving neither. Modern archaeological surveys conducted between 1975 and 2020 documented 15,000 individual artifacts scattered throughout the wreck site, ranging from medical instruments and pharmaceutical bottles to personal effects belonging to passengers and crew members who had survived the disaster. The ship's steel hull deteriorated at a rate of 0.24 millimeters per year, significantly slower than North Atlantic wrecks due to Mediterranean water conditions that included higher salinity, lower oxygen content, and reduced bacterial activity that accelerated corrosion in other marine environments. Her discovery attracted over 40 separate diving expeditions during the 45 years following Cousteau's initial exploration, while the wreck's precise coordinates at 37°4205 north, 24°17 to north east positioned her exactly 1.6 nautical miles from Kia's eastern shoreline. The site's depth of 400 feet placed the Britannic within the operational limits of advanced recreational diving equipment, making her the largest passenger shipwreck accessible to civilian exploration teams equipped with technical diving certification. Some diving teams reported experiencing unusual psychological effects during extended exploration of the wreck's interior spaces, describing feelings of unease and disorientation that seemed disproportionate to the normal stress associated with deep-water diving operations. The rational explanation involved nitrogen narcosis, a well-documented condition affecting divers at depths exceeding 100 feet, combined with the psychological impact of exploring spaces where human tragedy had occurred. The wreck's tilted orientation created spatial confusion that could trigger vertigo and anxiety in susceptible individuals, while the eerie preservation of medical equipment and personal artifacts provided constant reminders of the disaster's human cost. Yet the consistency of these reports across multiple diving expeditions, documented by teams with extensive deep-water experience, suggested that the Britannic's environment produced effects that transcended normal diving-related stress responses. The hospital ship's pristine condition had transformed her into an underwater museum that preserved not just physical artifacts, but the essential mystery of her destruction. Each diving expedition revealed new details while raising additional questions about the circumstances that had sent her to the Mediterranean floor. Her secrets protected by 400 feet of azure water that filtered sunlight into the eternal twilight where maritime history rested in magnificent, haunting silence. In death, the Britannic discovered what she had never achieved in life. A story compelling enough to emerge from the Titanic's overwhelming shadow. The hospital ship's fate encapsulated the broader tragedy of the Great War with poetic precision. Her noble mission of mercy destroyed by the industrial-scale violence that had transformed the Mediterranean into a maritime graveyard, where neutrality offered no protection against the mechanical brutality of modern warfare. Her wreck became a monument to the collision between humanitarian idealism and military necessity, resting in waters that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations while preserving evidence of humanity's capacity for both compassion and destruction. The Britannic's legacy lived not in popular memory, but in the maritime safety protocols her brief life and sudden death had helped to forge. Her revolutionary design features incorporated into regulations that would govern passenger vessel construction for the remainder of the 20th century. Naval architects studying her wreck discovered that the safety improvements installed after the Titanic disaster had indeed functioned as intended, preventing catastrophic loss of life despite the massive hull breach that had doomed the vessel itself. The 97% survival rate achieved during her sinking validated the engineering principles that Thomas Andrews had pioneered, even as it demonstrated the limitations of any technological solution when confronted with the random violence of wartime conditions. The hospital ship's transformation from luxury liner to medical vessel and ultimately to underwater archaeological site reflected the broader transformation of maritime transportation during an era when steam-powered vessels represented the pinnacle of human technological achievement. Her story embodied the transition from an age of optimistic progress, when passenger ships served as floating palaces, carrying the elite across oceans in unprecedented comfort, to a period of industrial warfare where civilian vessels became military targets and humanitarian missions offered no immunity from destruction. International maritime law evolved significantly in response to the questions raised by the Britannic's sinking, as legal scholars and military planners struggled to define the boundaries between legitimate military action and war crimes in an environment where hospital ships, merchant vessels, and passenger liners all sailed through the same contested waters. The ambiguity surrounding her destruction became a case study in the challenges of applying 19th century diplomatic conventions to 20th century technological warfare, where submarines could strike without warning and mines could drift far from their intended deployment zones to threaten innocent vessels. The wreck site's designation as a protected war grave under international treaty recognized the Britannic status as both a maritime archaeological treasure and a memorial to the medical personnel who had died in service of wounded soldiers during the Great War. The legal framework protecting her remains established precedents that would influence underwater cultural heritage preservation throughout the Mediterranean, where countless vessels from multiple historical periods rested on the seabed as witnesses to humanity's long relationship with maritime technology and naval warfare. Modern underwater archaeology had revealed the Britannic's secrets with scientific precision that would have astonished the naval investigators who had attempted to determine the cause of her destruction using only survivor testimony and fragmentary physical evidence. Advanced imaging technology documented every detail of the massive hull breach, while metallurgical analysis of steel samples provided insights into the explosive forces that had torn through her reinforced plating. Yet despite decades of intensive study, the fundamental question of whether she had struck a mine or been torpedoed by a German submarine remained unresolved, a maritime mystery preserved in the eternal twilight, 100 feet beneath the Mediterranean surface. The scale of archaeological investigation conducted at the Britannic wreck site exceeded that of any other passenger vessel from the early 20th century, generating scientific documentation that transformed understanding of both the disaster itself and the broader context of maritime warfare during World War I. Research teams had completed over 200 documented dives to the wreck between 1975 and 2020, producing 50,000 hours of underwater video footage that captured every accessible section of the vessel's remarkably preserved structure. Scientific analysis identified 847 distinct artifact categories scattered throughout the wreck site, including 156 different types of medical instruments that provided insights into battlefield medicine practices during the Great War. The wreck's environmental monitoring systems detected structural deterioration rates that suggested the vessel would remain substantially intact for at least 500 additional years, barring major seismic activity or human interference that could accelerate the natural corrosion processes affecting her steel framework. Modern GPS positioning technology had established the wreck's location with centimeter-level accuracy, enabling precise mapping that documented her 915-foot length and 94-foot beam as she rested on the rocky Mediterranean bottom. Some researchers reported experiencing vivid dreams during extended diving expeditions to the Britannic, describing nocturnal visions filled with images of wounded soldiers, medical personnel in period uniforms, and ghostly figures moving through the ship's tilted corridors. The rational explanation involved the psychological impact of prolonged exposure to a disaster site where human tragedy had occurred, combined with the physical stress of technical diving operations that required intensive mental concentration in challenging underwater conditions. The brain's processing of emotionally charged, historical information, particularly when experienced in the actual location where traumatic events had occurred, could generate dream imagery that reflected the diver's conscious absorption of the site's historical significance. Yet the remarkable consistency of these dream reports across multiple research teams, documented independently by individuals with no prior knowledge of similar experiences, suggested that the Britannic's environment produced psychological effects that deserved more detailed study than the scientific community had yet undertaken. The hospital ship's story had become a testament to the complexity of maritime history, where technological achievement, humanitarian mission, and wartime tragedy intersected in ways that continued to generate new questions rather than definitive answers. Her legacy transcended the circumstances of her destruction, encompassing the evolution of naval architecture, the development of international maritime law, and the ongoing challenge of preserving underwater cultural heritage for future generations of researchers and historians. The Britannic rested in her Mediterranean grave as both a memorial to the past and a laboratory for the future, her secrets preserved in eternal silence while her story continued to unfold through the patient work of archaeologists, historians, and marine scientists who recognized her significance to humanity's understanding of its relationship with the sea.